Okay. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for joining us um, in this webinar about CVA grant reporting and invoicing requirements. My name is Vicki Kambali, and I'm the Clean Vessel Act Education Coordinator with Florida Sea Grant. My position is funded through Florida Department of Environmental Protection through a grant from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. First, let's go over a few housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. However, if you'd like, I invite you to turn on your camera. Also, you are all muted, not because I don't want to hear from you, but just to reduce background noise. If you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. In fact, I encourage you to use the chat throughout the meeting as needed. You can go ahead and use it now to introduce yourself and maybe say what marina you're with or what city you're joining us from. If you have a question and would prefer to ask it verbally, just go ahead and raise your hand, which is under the React button. You could then unmute yourself and ask your question. Although I'm employed by Florida Sea Grant, the Clean Vessel Act program is housed in the Department of Environmental Protection. DEP is the one who distributes CVA grants, and they are the one you will submit all your reporting and invoicing to. There are a few people on the call from DEP. I wanted to give a chance for Tiffany and Tom to unmute and introduce themselves now.
All right. Can you see me? There we go. Hi, my name is Tiffany Herron, and I am the Clean Boating Administrator. And within the Clean Boating program is the CVA grant program, as well as the Clean Marina program.
My name is Thomas Cottle. I am a government operations consultant. I work under Tiffany as a intake specialist and advisor on the program for Clean Vessel Act.
Thank you, Tiffany and Tom. So for this program, we break Florida up into 4 regions, each with a regional coordinator. I'm going to ask them to use the chat to introduce themselves now, just to save some time. The regional coordinators conduct site visits for the Clean Vessel Act program and help implement the state's Clean Marina program as well. If your facility is interested and does become certified as a clean marina, you can save 10% off your state lands lease fees annually. So please reach out to your regional coordinators if you're interested in that. I just want to note in the Southwest region that Kira will be moving on from this position at the end of the year to further her career. So a big congratulations to Kira. If you know of anyone that might be interested in this position, it should be posted on our webpage and social media soon. Just let me know, email me or type in the chat, and I can share that job posting with you when it becomes available if you happen to know anyone that might be interested. So today's webinar kind of takes off where the last one ended. So the previous webinar was about how to apply for CVA pump out grant funding. It went over the entire application process. That webinar is available on our YouTube channel, which I will share a link to in the chat now. So that webinar went over everything, and then it kind of left off as you have the grant, it's fully executed, you're ready to begin work. And so this webinar will pick up from there. You've started work and now you have to submit reporting and invoicing materials. So here's an overview of what I'll be talking about, and I'm going to go ahead and just get started. So during the CVA grant period, all grantees, no matter what type of grant you have, if it's for equipment only or if it is for operations only or operations and maintenance, no matter what type of grant you have, all grantees are required to submit quarterly progress reports. Before you can submit a reimbursement package, you must submit deliverables, and they must be approved by DEP before you can submit for reimbursement. If you'd like to submit for a partial reimbursement package during the grant period, then with each partial reimbursement package, you need to first ensure your latest quarterly progress report was submitted, include the payment request summary, which is Exhibit C of your agreement. If applicable, include all vendor invoices and proof of payment. Also include in-house labor documents if applicable. If your grant is for operations, then you also need to include pump out logs and gallon reports during this partial reimbursement. So if you currently have a CVA grant, you should check your agreement. You will also need to include an invoice on your company's letterhead. Moving forward, newly executed contracts will not have this requirement, so I didn't include it here in the slide. But if you have questions about including an invoice on your company's letterhead, just let me or your grant manager know, and we can help you with that. So for operations grants, it's common to submit partial reimbursement packages on a regular schedule. Generally, they're submitted quarterly after the progress report and all those deliverables. If you have an equipment grant, sometimes some equipment grantees choose to submit a partial reimbursement package, perhaps after the equipment is purchased, but before it is installed. So it is available to everyone to submit partial reimbursement packages, but that is most common. When you submit a final reimbursement package, you need to ensure your latest quarterly progress report was submitted, your deliverables were submitted and approved, and then for the final reimbursement package, you need to include everything that's in the partial reimbursement that we just spoke about, an operational plan. If applicable, you need to include educational materials if that was part of your agreement and your scope of work. And then if you have an equipment grant and the equipment was for a dollar value of $10,000 or more, you need to include a property report-in form and photos. If you have a current CVA grant agreement, again, check your agreement. You also need to include a certificate of completion. Again, I didn't include that in the slide because moving forward, this will no longer be a requirement for newly executed contracts. But if you have any questions about that, again, please reach out to your grant manager or myself. If your CVA grant is for equipment, then you need to submit pump out log and gallon reports every quarter for 5 years after your project is completed. So now I'm going to go ahead and go over each one of these in a bit more detail. The quarterly progress report is Exhibit A of your grant agreement. It must be submitted 20 days from the end of the quarter. So let's say your grant started May 1st. That's in the middle of a quarter, right? But that quarter does end on June 30th. So you will need to still submit your quarterly progress report by July 20th. Now, you could submit it earlier. That's fine. You could submit it July 6th, maybe after the holiday, or the 10th. It just has to be submitted by the 20th, the latest. to submit, just go ahead and email that to your grant manager or the generic Clean Vessel Act email of DEP, which is clean.vessel.act@floridadep.gov. So the quarterly progress report form, pretty self-explanatory. The top information is just your project number, agreement number. Make sure you put in your grantee name and the report in period, both the year and the months. Then this first block here, this bigger one, that's where you want to put a brief overview of whatever you did during this first quarter. Maybe you haven't had the grant for very long and you just got updated invoices from vendors. Put that in there. Maybe you've had it for a long time, the site's prepared, the pump out was going in. Just explain what you did. You don't have to write a novel, right? It doesn't have to be super long, but this is what gives DEP an idea of what you did during that quarter. So please make sure to fill that out. You could include bullet points. We did X, Y, and Z. Sometimes that's a lot easier. Just make sure you include some sort of summary there of all the activities that happened. I know it says accomplishments to date, but think of accomplishments as any activities that occurred. The next section here is to provide an update on the estimated time for completion and an explanation if there are anticipated delays. So this is pretty easy. If your project's on time, go ahead and note that and let DEP know. This is the real world though, right? And delays do happen. So if that is the case for you, just explain what the delay is, what caused it, if you will be able to make up that time, how you're going to make up that time. If your schedule will be thrown off a little bit, go ahead and include an updated schedule. And if you think you'll need a contract extension, right? If you don't think you'll finish the project by the end date of the contract, let DEP know you might need to get an extension or an amendment to your agreement. And so you could work together on that. And then this third large section down here is for you to identify attachments. So this quarterly progress report, maybe you include some photos or copies of permits. This is one of the places where you could perhaps discuss and include some of your deliverables, which I'll talk about next. And then just make sure you sign it and date it and put in that project number. And that's pretty much the quarterly progress report. It's not too difficult, but if you ever have questions, reach out to your grant manager or to me. So, as I mentioned, deliverables must be submitted and approved before you submit for reimbursement. Your deliverables are found in attachment 3 of your grant agreement, and they're specific to your project, right? So every agreement is going to have different deliverables based on what their grant is for. I included some examples here. You could see a copy of the permit could be a deliverable that you include in your quarterly report. For site preparations, the deliverable might be before and after photos. So that's a photo before any site preparation was done, and then a photo after the site preparation was completed, but before the project was actually installed. So these are just some examples of deliverables. Again, familiarize yourself with your specific grant and the deliverables specific to you. Look at attachment 3 of your agreement. So for the partial reimbursement package, we already talked about quarterly progress report and deliverables that have to be submitted before then. It also includes Exhibit C, the payment request summary form, vendor invoices and proof of payment if applicable, in-house labor documents with proof of payment if applicable, and pump out log and gallon report. Again, this is for operations grant that you'll submit it during the partial reimbursement package. If your grant is for equipment, you'll still need to submit pump out logs and gallon reports, but not until the grant is completed, obviously, because you don't have that equipment installed, so no one will be using it. So for 5 years after the project is completed. And don't forget about that invoice on your company's letterhead if you have a current grant. Once you submit a partial reimbursement package, it takes DEP about 2 weeks to review, approve, and cut a check for that. Again, you can complete a partial reimbursement package quarterly, and that is common if you have a grant for operations, or you could complete it after equipment is purchased but before installed, whenever you think you need reimbursement. I will say, if you have an operations grant and you're going to submit reimbursement packages quarterly, make sure that what you include is just for that quarter. So if it's the first quarter, it should just be from January 1st to March 31st. So I'll go ahead into each one of these a little bit further. This is the payment request summary form. This first section up here, pretty basic information, your grant agreement number, name, how much you're requesting for reimbursement, and all those details. The second part here is for past payments. So if it's your very first time submitting for reimbursement, you can leave this section blank. This should help you, this section, determine how much money is left in each category. So if you're low on funds in a category, again, talk to your grant manager and let them know. You must have DEP approval before overspending in a category, and it might require a contract amendment. Even if you're under budget overall for the grant, the categories are really important, and you might need an amendment just to move money around within the grant. So talk to your grant manager. And then this bottom section here is for current expenditures. We recommend you fill out this form with Adobe. When you enter total requests, it automatically calculates total amounts, and same here. It'll calculate the grant amount versus the grantee match and the remaining balance. So filling it out with Adobe will really be helpful. And use attachment 3 of your agreement, which is your work plan, to help you fill out this Exhibit C. And of course, don't forget to sign it. DEP accepts wet signatures or a certified Adobe signature. If your grant includes contractors, so maybe if you have an operations grant, this isn't applicable to you, but if it does include vendors and contractors, make sure you have an invoice with the date that the invoice was issued and the date that it was paid. Both of those dates should be within your contract period, so make sure of that. The invoice should also have a zero balance due. And if there's a signature line, make sure that the invoice is signed. It doesn't have to be if there's not a signature line, but if a signature line is on that invoice, it has to be signed. If the invoice shows parts, or whatever the invoice is showing, there should be an explanation in your progress report about what was done with those materials. So whatever the invoice shows, explain it in your progress report. Proof of payment can include canceled checks, credit card receipts, or bank statements. Here I'm showing a canceled check. All of these proofs of payment can be easily obtained by logging on to your company's bank account, or if you have an accountant, asking them. It should not be too difficult to obtain these, and they are required for reimbursement. So if your grant includes in-house labor, so if it's for operations, you have staff that are operating that pump out, or if maybe your grant is for equipment and installation, maybe you have a plumber or electrician on staff that will do that installation, or maybe you're putting up the signage yourself. Any in-house labor that you have, you need to include documentation of that labor with proof of payment. So the documentation should include the employee's name, the date that they worked, their hourly rate of pay, and how many hours they worked. As a reminder, if you have an operations grant and you have a staff member that works 8 hours a day, they can only be reimbursed for the amount of time that they're actively conducting pump outs. So you can see on October 3rd, they're requesting reimbursement for 1 hour. Even though that employee probably worked more than 1 hour that day, they likely only did 2 or 3 pump outs to request reimbursement for. So that's why you're only seeing 1 hour on that date. And then proof of payment can be something like a QuickBooks report or the like. Feel free to include additional information. And this is just an example of one. If you have trouble getting that, please again reach out to your grant manager and they will let you know what is acceptable. So this is mostly for operations grants during the grant period. You are required to submit your pump out log, which is shown here. And then for equipment grants, you have to submit this for 5 years after completion of the project on that quarterly schedule. So this is really easy to complete if you have someone on the dock doing the pump outs, right? They could just jot down the date, the time, their name, if the vessel was from Florida or not, and estimate the gallons pumped and if they collected any fees. So that's pretty easy if you have someone that is doing the pump outs for the boater. And then here you have the gallon report. So the Excel that DEP has 5 different sheets or tabs on that Excel sheet. When you fill out the log in Excel, it will automatically populate this quarterly pump out report. So you don't have to calculate all these numbers, it automatically populates this. So that's great. If you got an equipment grant and you're putting it out on your dock, but it's going to be self-serve. So you're not going to have a staff there to do the pump outs. So you maybe won't have that log. Obviously you can't submit that then, but you can estimate these numbers. So maybe you won't know how many boaters there from Florida or out of state use the pump out, but hopefully you'll have an idea of the total number of boaters. Gallons pumped can be calculated with the hour counter and fees collected. Even if you're not there, you have to have some mechanism to collect those fees. So you should know that. If you're not there, you could look at your hour counter. So some of the hour counters include pump cycles. That's how many times the pump was turned on and then off. So that's an indication of how many boaters used that pump. Maybe it's a few less if it's on an automatic timer and the boat needs 2 rounds or 2 times to turn that on to empty their holding tank, especially if the on switch is far away from their boat, so they have to walk down the dock to turn it on, walk back, pump out their boat, and then it stops halfway through. Hopefully that's not the case and you have a remote on-off switch for boaters, but even if that is the case, you can still use these hour counters to get the information you need to complete this quarterly pump out report. You should not be making up numbers for this. If you're not having anyone on staff filling out the log because it's not full service, let me know. I could help you by just looking at these hour counters and maybe doing a 5-gallon bucket test. Get a good estimate of how many gallons have been pumped. Because for this sheet, the most important thing is the number of gallons pumped and fees collected. You should know both of those or be able to estimate gallons. All right, so that is it for the partial reimbursement package. For the final reimbursement package, you need to include everything we just talked about for the partial, plus an operation plan. If your grant is for equipment, you also need to include photos. If that equipment costs $10,000 or more, you need to include the Exhibit B, which is the property reporting form. And if you have a executed contract right now, check out that contract. You also need to include a certificate of completion. For any newly executed contracts, this will no longer be a requirement, but if it is in your contract, you have to comply with what that says. So let's go ahead into each one of these a little bit further. Operations and maintenance plans should include instructions on how to use the pump and anything specific to your facility. If it needs to be turned on or unlocked for each time a boater needs to use it, then that should be written in the operations plan. The hours that the pump will be open to the public, if it will be self-serve or full serve, any emergency contact phone numbers if something happens to that pump and no staff is on site, there should be an emergency number. This doesn't have to be posted at the pump, but it should be included in the operations plan that you share with DEP. There should be a generic phone number for the facility posted at the pump though. And then for maintenance, check with the pump manufacturer. They very likely have preventative maintenance information that is specific to their equipment. On our website, which I just included a link to in the chat, we also have maintenance suggestions in this publication here called Pump Out and Dump Station Considerations for Increased Durability. Go ahead and check out that PDF. And you'll see at the end, there's this maintenance sheet that shows maintenance that should be done weekly, monthly, and as needed. And then check the CVA grant application instruction packet as well. They have examples. If you have an operations grant, you could submit this early. I suspect you should have this early anyway. You could always submit things early, but you can't submit them late. So I would suggest if you have an operations grant to go ahead and have this, maybe for that first quarterly report, you could include it there and it would likely be one of your deliverables and that would be fine. So if you have an equipment grant, you need to include photos that show the pump is fully installed. So all these photos are at the same facility. You could see that the pump here is installed. There are in-slip connections with a mobile cart with the hose. And then there's a public access site here with a stanchion or pedestal. You could also see some signages posted, which is the next thing. So you also need photos that show the signage is posted and easily visible. And then finally, you need to show that the pump out symbol sign is visible to boaters from the waterway. So the photo here on the left, it's not the best one. I took it. I wasn't able to get out on the water to take that photo, so I just had to reach over the railing with my phone, pray I didn't drop it in the water, and take a photo. So it's not the best one. If that's all you could get, include it with photos like this. and you could label like this is the pump out sign, and together these photos show that it is facing the waterway. But ideally, if you're able to get out on the water, you get a photo like the one here on the right that shows the pump out sign is facing the water, and it's easier to see that. Uh, if you have a pump out vessel, the signage for that is a little bit different, right? Because it's on the vessel and there's specific locations where it needs to be. So on the helm of the vessel is where the DEP logo should be, the Sportfish Restoration logo, and credit in text. And then on the sides of the vessel is where the Universal Pump Out logo will go, contact information like the phone number you see here, DEP's logo, the Sportfish logo, and the boat owner name or logo. Here you could see it's Martin County. All right. If your grant was for equipment, you need to submit the property report in form if that equipment was $10,000 or more. This is pretty easy to fill out. There's instructions up here, but it just includes a description of the equipment, the serial number, the source, like where you purchased it from, the manufacturer, the owner, that is the legal name of the entity that owns it. So what is your legal marina name? The date it was purchased, how much it cost, how much was charged to your DEP grant, the location of where that equipment is, the use and condition, and then ultimately, where will it be disposed of and how, if there will be a sale price. So likely there won't be a sale price because you'll keep it up until it has no more value, but go ahead and include that and don't forget to sign it as well. And again, this is only if your equipment purchase is over $10,000. If your grant also includes educational materials, maybe you have a marina newsletter and you put CVA specific information about how to use the pump or the laws related to sewage discharges, that could potentially be reimbursable if it's in your agreement. But DEP must approve your educational materials before they are published or printed. So make sure that you get their approval before publishing or printing, and go ahead and include those on your final reimbursement package. So I just wanted to put this slide up again so you could see the overview of all reporting and invoicing requirements. And you'll notice those differences between if your grant is for operations versus if it's for equipment. Again, your grant manager is your friend. Keep them updated. If you have problems, let them know. Let them know of delays. We're here to help. We want to make sure that you comply with all the requirements and it's not too painful. So stay in touch. We have a quarterly newsletter. If you go to that link that I had shared in the chat, there's a section for where you could subscribe to the newsletter. It's just sent out 4 times a year, so we won't clutter your inbox. And we have 2 more webinars coming up, one on March 3rd and another on May 19th of next year. One will be about hurricane preparedness. I suspect that will be a panel discussion and that will not be recorded, so everyone will be free to interact and talk without having to be recorded. And then the following one is expected to be a webinar with the pump manufacturers themselves. So if you have a pump and have any issues at all with it, you could speak directly with the manufacturer of that pump, as well as other marinas, see what they did to solve their problems. Or concerns. And again, that one will not be recorded so that we have an open dialogue and everyone is free to speak without being recorded. So I want to thank DEP. Again, they are the ones that distribute, and host the Clean Vessel Act program for the state of Florida, and here is their contact information on the screen. And I want to thank all of you for participating today. Here is my contact information. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.